Today's theme is meetings in English.
Yeah, so we will be covering all the way from preparing for a meeting to going through the meeting itself, what happens after the meeting, and along the way, talking about some cultural differences that come up with meetings in global companies, and particularly North American style meetings as well.
So next topic is starting a meeting, right?
Yes. So often what happens in the case of a North American meeting specifically, there's time for small talk, as we've covered before. And then the chairperson will say something like, we should get started. So thank you all for coming today. And then talk about the agenda and the objectives of the meeting. This is, of course, covered usually in a brief way at the beginning of the meeting so we know what all of the items are. They might mention, first, we'll discuss sales for the quarter. After that, we'll cover the spring marketing campaign. Finally, we'll be voting on where to have our year-end party. Then, of course, as the meeting proceeds, we're following the agenda. And this is, of course, where the chair or facilitator plays a significant role. For example, maybe one point is being discussed for too long, and they're concerned that if we spend too long, then we won't be able to cover the rest of the items. The chair might say something like, we're running short on time, or we're running behind schedule, so let's skip to the next item, or let's table that item for now. And of course, sometimes discussions might happen that might not be on the agenda. And this is where the chair also plays an important role. If something goes off topic, they might suggest something like, let's save this for another meeting. Or they could even suggest, if it's an online meeting, let's take this offline. One other aspect is brainstorming. And I think Japanese business, there is the brainstorming process as well. But in North American culture, it may seem very disorganized. The reason is that in brainstorming, there is the idea that it's quantity over quality. So you're just supposed to shout out whatever ideas come into your mind. We want to get as many ideas as possible. Sometimes Japanese, depending on the personality, might be a little kind of scared because there's the idea, well, I want to make sure to give a good idea. And I think that's kind of the opposite of what brainstorming is supposed to be, is just don't be afraid to shout out something, because in brainstorming, no one's going to say, oh, that's a terrible idea, because that's not the point. You just want to get it all out, get everything out, and then pick out the ideas. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, meetings, typically, especially North American meetings, there is often disagreement and debate that happens. But of course, it's still supposed to be civilized so that it's not a shouting match. We want to be polite when we disagree. So, for example, I'm afraid I have to disagree. Or on the opposite side, if someone's quite enthusiastic, of course, you can say, I agree. Or you might hear a phrase, I couldn't agree with you more, which might be a bit confusing at first if you haven't heard it before. But of course, if you're, I couldn't agree with you more, that means I agree with you 100%. It's a very strong way of agreeing and showing in a very enthusiastic way. So the person who's saying it is probably quite excited. Yeah. Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. That's such a great point that you made. Also, if someone else mentions some new information, I'm glad you brought that up, which is a way of saying thank you for introducing that bit of information.
So, as we had contents before, can I say like this? I agree. However,
yes, you can. And to make it even clearer, you could say, I agree with what you said here. However, I'm afraid I have to disagree with this point here. And that's perfectly acceptable. Or you could also say, I understand your viewpoint. However, and then explain what it is that you disagree with or why you disagree. So it shows that, as opposed to just saying something like "you're wrong" or "that's totally wrong," that's not a good way. Not a good way. Even though we like to debate, we like to think that we're doing it in a more civilized way. So those are some ways to more politely disagree.
Sometimes, as I'm not native English speaker, I miss some part. I sometimes don't understand what they said. In that case, sometimes I hesitate to stop and ask question. But is there any good way to ask question during this meeting?
That's a good question. I would say in most meetings where it's maybe a smaller department meeting, you shouldn't be afraid to ask questions. I think if you do it in a suitably humble way, for example, you could say, if I could just come in here, or if I could just interrupt and then ask your question, could you clarify this point? Just like you might do in a more casual conversation, but use slightly more formal language. Again, in a more formal annual general meeting, where it's something where there are large people, a large group of people, you may just want to talk to the person beside you. So what did he say? Because you may not be able to, it may not be so good a good opportunity to interrupt the speaker if it's someone they're speaking in front of hundreds of people. But you could clarify with the person next to you. Just ask, okay, what did...
Should we move to the next topic?
Sure. So that would come to closing a meeting. Usually the chair will be the person to wrap things up or to finish the meeting. So they might say, if no one has anything else to add, let's wrap things up. And at that point, the decisions that were made during the meeting will usually be summarized. And usually that will also be sent out after the meeting in an email or communications. We all have the understanding, and it's all written out so that everyone can see and that there is no misunderstanding of what decisions were made or what the next steps are. And one other thing comes up in meetings and presentations as well is the use of PowerPoints and the amount of information. I think quite typically in what I've observed in Japanese meetings is that usually PowerPoints have a lot of writing, a lot of information on them. This is quite opposite of how they're used in North American meetings. Typically, when there's a PowerPoint, the idea is that there's just a few bullet points and it's kept very simple because the expectation is that the speaker will fill in the details. A lot of American workers, as soon as they see all of that text on a PowerPoint, their brains will probably shut down. When you make PowerPoints, keep them very simple, just a few key words, and expect that you can fill in the details as you speak.
Yeah, thank you, John. I can learn today preparation for the meeting is very important. And basically like saying something in the meeting is very important.
Yes. Yeah, debate, it's considered an important part of the culture, and it's considered a sign of intelligence. So that's another reason that sharing your opinion, particularly in North America, is considered quite important.
Yeah. So in Japan, silence means like yes, but probably in North America, silence means kind of weird or kind of...
As you said, in Japan, silence is showing respect, showing you agree that you're seriously considering the situation. Whereas if you're silent in North America, they think, well, have you even paid attention to what we've been talking about? Have you been thinking, or were you just sleeping, or what was going on? So it's a big cultural misunderstanding there. So hopefully you can reach understanding both ways and adapt.
Yes, Johnson, thank you very much.